So today's speaker is Anil Vullikanti, who is our colleague and friend for a long, long time. Anil is probably too tired of being with me for such a long time, but we've been working together for now 20 years plus. And he has done some very cool work with other folks in the group on using game theory to understand how epidemics spread and how they can be controlled on networks. That's the key aspect of it. So Anil, take it away. Thanks so much for doing this. He's also the co-PI and I would say a critical member of the epidemics project.
I'd like to first mention a special acknowledgement to Madhav for starting me off on algorithmic game theory a long time back. It was on different problems on transportation routing, and since then I've been interested. The work I'll be talking today, I'm really grateful for several collaborators and current and former members of PI. So the work I'll talk about today, it's some of it is sort of an overview from some older work, which sets up a nice, I think, game theoretic framework for looking at epidemic behaviors. So that general problem turns out to be real hard, and so we've been chipping away at different restricted versions, incorporating like one type of behavior and one type of constraint at a time. And then I'll also talk about some ongoing work with several colleagues. I know we have many different modeling collaborators and they use very different kinds of models. And so I'll just briefly talk about network model. So we have a contact network. An edge represents an opportunity for a disease to spread from one node to its neighbor. So this node, which is red, is infectious, and in one time step, it can cause a neighbor to get infected independently with some probability p. So we'll assume uniform in all of the stuff. What happens to that node after it causes that infection in the next time step determines the model sort of. So if it recovers and becomes immune, that's an SIR model, or it can remain infected, and that's an SI type model. And then there are really zillions of other disease models which depend on the specific disease and specific phenomenon being modeled. So we'll focus on SIR and SI type models here. And a vaccination strategy can be modeled as a node removal. So in this network here, if these two green nodes are vaccinated, so we'll assume it has perfect efficacy, so it can be removed from the network. And then it sort of blocks off the disease from going from the part on the left to part on the right. So there are various costs for that individual in getting vaccinated or complying with a vaccine policy. The current policies being discussed are like vaccination by age and whether they're working in critical care and so on. But would an individual comply? So there are various components of cost for an individual. So first is just the dollar value. There can be side effects or fear of side effects. There can be other kinds of cost coming from not conforming to neighbors. So if a person gets vaccinated, but his or her contacts do not, each such edge could potentially add cost. On the other hand, for social distancing type interventions, it's like breaking edges. So if a node breaks this particular contact, that's an edge deletion. It leads to other kinds of costs for the individual. So the cost of breaking that tie, so like stopping work or not doing usual activities and so on. And again, there could be a cost of non-conformance. In both cases, because there's a benefit to the individual in terms of reduced risk of infection. So there's a very natural game theoretic setting where there's a trade-off between the costs of these actions and the benefits for each agent. And so there's a role for strategic behavior. So here is an epidemic game framework to think about these decisions and the associated costs. So again, we have a contact graph G, there's a transmission probability, and we'll assume some disease model. I'll assume an initial condition with the disease starts at a random node. I'll assume it's uniform. Let's just focus initially on vaccination strategies. So if XV is 1, that means it's vaccinated, and I'll assume it has perfect efficacy. There is a cost CVAC if node V is vaccinated. So it's CVAC times XV is the resulting cost. The other component comes from getting infected. So for that, we need to look at the infection probability. So first, let's consider this notion of a residual graph, GRES X, which is obtained by deleting each vaccinated node from the graph. And then PVX is the probability that node V gets infected in the residual graph. Let's just work out the definitions some more. In this example here, these two green nodes, XU1 and U7 are vaccinated. So XU1 and XU7 are 1, and all the remaining XUs are 0. And this is the residual graph when you remove these two vaccinated nodes. So one quantity we'll be talking about later is the component containing V in the residual graph. So in this case, in the residual graph has only one component, but in general, it might have multiple components. The probability that a node V gets infected is basically the probability that disease is going to, so let's consider node U2. It's a probability that U2 gets infected within this residual graph, starting from the initial conditions of random source. So this is a global quantity and is difficult to compute and needs a lot of information. So one approach we've explored is to use information from a D-hop closed neighborhood. NV GRESD is like all the nodes within D hops. So when D is 1, so for node U8, the one neighborhood is U8 and U9. So we'll basically define the probability for a node as the probability that it gets infected on the graph restricted to this one neighborhood. And so in this case, for U8, the probability is 1 over n if it itself was the source. And then P times 1 over n if U9 is the source and the disease spreads from U9 to U8. And similarly, if D equals 2, then this is the 2 neighborhood for U8, and you can work out the probability that this node would get infected in that. Now that we have this notion of the probability that node gets infected, and within discussion, we'll fix a particular D and look at the probability with respect to that. So if it gets infected, it incurs some cost CN, like staying home and the health costs and things like that. The expected cost is its probability times CN. And so the expected cost for a node is the vaccination cost, so CVAC times XV, if it is 1, plus the infection cost, so the probability that it became sick, and times the infection cost.
Anil, one clarifying question. If assuming a person doesn't get vaccinated and they get infected, you assume that they're not taken out, right? They'll continue to propagate the infection.
So in this case, I'm assuming that the vaccine is also preventing like transmission.
Right. No, not in the case of vaccine. So let's say a node V got infected without the vaccine.
Yeah.
But they will continue to be a part of the residual graph and be a transmitter as well.
Yeah. Right. So in the SI model, like it'll keep continuing to infect. If it is SIR, it would participate in the transmission till it gets recovered, but then its neighbors would. So basically, we would run the SIR process on the residual graph and calculate the probability.
Yeah, because
so basically it's actually reliability starting from a random source for this node.
Okay, good. That's one I would check, because you could think of if you get infected, then you stay back, and then that would change the residual graph, but you're not doing that.
No, right. I think, I think all of those are good variations too. So the other quantity we'll be considering is the total cost of the strategy or the social cost, which is just the sum of the costs of all nodes. And just as an illustration, mention how one can incorporate other kinds of epidemic decisions, so like social distancing. So here, edges could be broken. So if U4 decides to break the edge U4, U3, so SU4, U3 is 1, and so on. So U4, U1 is 1, and so on. And the SUI, UJ for remaining edges is 0. So the residual graph would be obtained by breaking those edges. So an edge has 2 endpoints, and either endpoint could break that edge. And so the decisions SUV and SVU are independent, and either one would result in the edge breaking, but it's not necessary. So in a Nash, for instance, only one of them will choose to break that edge. Again, there's a residual graph with the edges gone, and you can look at the probability that a node gets infected in this residual graph. So now we can put, just as again an illustration, both vaccination decisions and social distancing decisions together. So a node can decide whether to get vaccinated or not, whether to break an edge or not. And so the X is the strategy vector corresponding to vaccinations, S is the strategy vector corresponding to social distancing. PV is the probability that it gets infected with respect to these strategies. And so now this is the cost structure. So there's a vaccination cost, social distancing cost, and the expected infection cost. And again, one can add costs due to like non-conformance, and we'll talk briefly in the end about that.
Hi, Anil. Could you explain again the social distancing cost, please, when you're vaccinated? What is the cost?
Yeah, so they are independent decisions, whether a node gets vaccinated or not, and whether or not they decide to do social distancing on some edges. If they break an edge, there is a cost of breaking that edge. So they incur a cost for each such action they do. Yeah.
So if they're vaccinated, why are they social distancing?
So in that case, they would not need to break any other edge. Yeah. So in a Nash equilibrium, for instance, vaccinated nodes would have no incentive to break an edge.
Okay.
And pay that and then pay that cost, right?
Okay.
It'll automatically be, it'll come for free.
Yeah. And do people know who is vaccinated or not?
Yeah, so I'm assuming full information like X and S are completely known in everything that I'm going to discuss.
Okay, so others could also decide to social distance from people who are not vaccinated as well.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in general, I think what you bring up is a really interesting and important issue to consider, like how much information is available. So at least this parameter D limits how much information is used in this decision, and that's a nice feature of this formulation.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. And like as Gizem already brought out one part of the, so there are many dimensions to these games, and one can enrich it in many ways. So information is one, uncertainty. There are other kinds of actions. So like compliance to testing could be one, because for some people, getting tested and having a positive result incurs a certain cost, and there's some inhibition to getting tested. The formulation I've talked about, it's a simultaneous action version. That's not meaningful in all settings. And so temporal versions would be relevant, and also repeated games. Especially for social distancing, the decision has to be made every day. So in some ways, it's game played out at every time. There are direct costs associated with these actions, and the peer pressure or not conforming is like an indirect cost. So this makes the problem really complicated, and so we'll just focus on restricted forms of this game. Even those become pretty hard and interesting, and I hope to give you a flavor of those kinds of results. So before I go on, I want to just very briefly place this in the context of the broader area of game theory and epidemics. So first, there's a really huge literature on population games using differential equation models, starting from the work of Bosch et al. And maybe even earlier, and then Allison and Tim Reluga and Simon and Ramanan and lots of folks on the team as well have a lot of interesting work and very fundamental contributions. A lot of this work uses like expected utility theory for modeling how individuals choose from a set of strategies. So then you can write down like some kind of cost or utility and think about decisions which optimize that cost. Of course, from the behavioral economics literature, there is a lot of work on how people actually decide, and there are more complicated formulations. Those make the whole problem much more complex and difficult to analyze. I think there hasn't been as much work on that front as there should be. This work on population games has already been applied to a huge number of settings, like vaccine compliance and scares and decisions over time with waning immunity, different kinds of interventions. And so it's already a really mature field. The pros in this approach are the disease dynamics can be explicitly incorporated into the cost function. Often there's a unique equilibrium. So there are a few parameters. There are tools for characterizing the equilibrium. And then there are methods from MDPs to solve such games. So while these problems are not any simpler, this area is mature enough, and there are lots of analytical and computational tools for solving such games. And so that's been a really popular area. However, one big limitation is it's difficult to incorporate like heterogeneity of contacts. So they assume that all nodes are basically identical unless you explicitly make some like a meta population type model. But that even there, you're limited in how big one can go. So it's hard to incorporate like the heterogeneity you would get from a network and its impact on how decisions would be made. On the other hand, like there's also a lot of work on games on networks. Many of them, like coordination games, have local costs, like the costs depend on local quantities. There are also games like network formation games, which have global quantities like properties of the network, which get constructed as part of the cost structure for nodes. But the epidemic games have this nature as a player as well in terms of the stochasticity of the disease model and the source, which adds new element to the complexity. So as I'll hope to convince you, epidemic games pose new kinds of computational challenges. So pure Nash equilibria might not exist. Deciding if they do is often NP complete. The graph structure makes characterization and analysis much more complicated and messy. Even if you have few parameters, so like everyone has the same vaccination cost, same infection cost, and so on, the graph structure and graph properties provide like an endless set of parameters, which make it harder to get as clean results as in the case of population games. The probability of infection is a much more complicated quantity, and it's global, and even calculating that is hard. And it's sensitive to network changes, which makes this a hard problem. A lot of the work has focused on p equals 1, starting from like the paper by Asmus et al., which I haven't cited here, because even that becomes algorithmically pretty hard. When p less than 1 has been handled, it's often been using like mean field approximations. And I've mentioned a couple of different ways to handle that. The net result of all of these difficulties is that epidemic games on networks haven't been used as extensively as the population games literature in understanding different kinds of behaviors and impact of interventions. So our focus is, since agent-based models and network analysis is becoming ubiquitous, the goal is to study the structure and complexity of games which have similar assumptions as these models. Okay, so the rest of the talk, I'll go over definitions of Nash equilibria and some results for the epidemic game for different D. And then another result I'll briefly mention is when we look at the effects of peer pressure, and then some summary and more questions than what we can answer. For a Nash equilibrium, we need to first define the strategy obtained by flipping a node strategy. So flip Vx is the strategy obtained by flipping its decision. So basically, xv becomes 1 minus xv, and for all nodes u not equal to v, the strategy remains the same. As I mentioned before, we are focusing on pure strategies in which xv is 0 or 1. This is as opposed to mixed, in which it can be a fraction, in which case it would be a probability that node decides to vaccinate with that probability. So X is a Nash equilibrium if no node is able to unilaterally reduce its cost by flipping its strategy. So basically for all V, the cost of flipping is not less than its current cost. So a popular quantity in algorithmic game theory is the price of anarchy. So it is the factor by which the cost increases by decentralized choice. So just to motivate this, so if you had complete control on who gets vaccinated, and the policy planner's goal is to minimize the cost, then you would choose an x which coming from the denominator, minimize x, which minimizes this cost. But if people are going to behave in a decentralized manner and the solution is a Nash, then the cost might become as high as in the numerator. So the max overall Nash, the largest cost, and so price of anarchy is that ratio. Okay, so what's a characterization of Nash in such games? It's actually intuitive and simple. Let tau be this ratio of the vaccination cost to the infection cost. So X is the pure Nash if and only if the following holds. For an unvaccinated node, XV, so if XV is 0, the probability of infection is at most this ratio tau V. And for all vaccinated nodes, if you flip its strategy, the probability becomes larger. Let me illustrate through this example, and let's just focus on the p equals 1 case. Let's consider this node V, which is unvaccinated, and this is the residual graph. So p is 1, so the probability of infection for V is simply the size of this component over n. For this unvaccinated node, this component should not be too large. And in general, if it's p not equal to 1, basically this probability should not be too large, so it's not well connected. On the other hand, this node U, which is vaccinated, so XU is 1, the new component which forms if it were to become unvaccinated is not too big. So the new component would be C1, C2 union U, so all these edges would come back. So this should not be too big or it should not be too well connected. So basically, a Nash equilibrium in this kind of game is almost at this knife's edge. So like all components are smallish, and if any one node decides to flip, then it becomes above some threshold. So it seems even surprising if Nash were to exist. So let's look at D equals 1 and again recall the definition. So the cost is vaccination cost plus this infection cost. So in the D equals 1 case, the probability has a simple expression. So it's 1 plus p times the neighbors in the residual graph divided by n. Here I'm using n to be the open neighborhood. Sorry, I mentioned closed. But yeah, so basically probability V gets infected is 1 plus p times the number of neighbors divided by n. This is because we have a random source. So in this case, actually, we can show that pure Nash always exists, and it can be computed by a best response strategy. It's actually a potential game. One can come up with a potential function which always reduces if a dissatisfied node flips its strategy. And also there's a nice bound for the price of anarchy. Again, recall the definition. It's the maximum cost of any Nash to the social optimum. One can show that this is bounded by the maximum degree of a node in the graph plus 1. What happens when D equals infinity? So again, here I'll just talk about the p equals 1 case. So the probability a node gets infected is the size of the component over n. So in this example, if U4 and U8 are vaccinated, the probability for U1 is going to be the size of this component 3 over 9, the number of nodes. Again, in the D unbounded case, so it's really the D which is relevant in this case is the diameter of the graph. So in this case, and when p equals 1, sorry, I forgot to mention that. Again, one can show that pure Nash always exists, and it can be computed using a best response strategy. There is a nice bound on the price of anarchy in terms of a fundamental graph property, which is its expansion. For a set S, we define its expansion as a ratio of the number of neighbors it has outside S divided by its size. And so in this example here, for this set S, it has 2 neighbors in the rest of the graph. So the expansion of this set is 2 over 3. And the expansion of the graph is min over all sets of size at most n over 2 of gamma of S. So we can show that the price of anarchy is bounded by like 1 over the expansion. What happens when D is not 1 or infinity? In general, there exist instances where no pure Nash exists, and determining if a pure Nash exists turns out to be NP complete. Yeah, maybe I briefly mention the social optimum. So we derived bounds on the price of anarchy, and then we look at properties of Nash obtained by best response, since we know that converges to a pure Nash. So in order to evaluate its quality, we should be able to compute the social optimum. So again, recall the social optimum is strategy X star, which minimizes the total cost. It turns out it is NP complete to find this, but we can get an approximation which depends on D. So for any D, we can get a 2D approximation. And when D is unbounded, we can get a logarithmic approximation. One natural question which comes out is, if you take a Nash X, how big is the outbreak if you decide vaccinations based on that? The price of anarchy sort of gives us a bound, because the cost of the worst Nash over like the social optimum, but not, it doesn't tell us explicitly about this outbreak size, because the total cost has two components. It's the cost of infections plus the cost of vaccinations. So what can we say about the expected outbreak size in this residual graph? What we can show is that in this D equals 1 case, there is this nice dichotomy. So if you look at this parameter n times the vaccination cost over the infection cost, if it is strictly less than 2, then the number of infections in this residual graph is small. But when it is larger than 2, there exist instances where it can be large. And we see this interesting behavior in, so these are some results from a random graph model, the preferential attachment model. Sorry, these legends are not very big, but on the x-axis is this parameter alpha. So n times the vaccination cost over infection cost. And the y-axis is the number of nodes which are vaccinated here. For different p-values, and you see that there is a certain drop in the number of vaccinations. And this plot shows the expected number of infections on the y-axis. And so you see there is a nice jump as alpha increases. So it is small, and then there's a sharp rise in the number of infections. It'll be nice to actually prove this more rigorously, this threshold phenomenon in this and other graphs. We have some similar results in other classes of graph, like social contact networks, but they're not as sharp, and that's still work in progress. So one question is, what kinds of nodes get picked up in the Nash, and specifically, are they all high degree nodes? And this plot shows that there are lots of high degree nodes which end up in the Nash, but they're not just that. So this is showing the Jacquard similarity of the set of nodes which are picked, which get vaccinated in the Nash, and the set of the same number of high degree nodes. So the scale goes from like 0.5 to 1. So some fraction are picked up, but there are lots of other lower degree nodes as well. I think this threshold behavior with respect to this parameter is a interesting phenomenon and is worth exploring further. The nice thing about this parameter is this: if you give incentives for vaccination, reduce its cost, you can get this numerator down. You can push this to the left. So in the case of d equals infinity, one can like sort of get a weaker statement. So if this parameter, same parameter, is little of n, the expected number of infections is little of n. And we see this qualitatively somewhat similar, but not like a phase transition type of thing. So there's again the same network, the preferential attachment, and this is for p equals 1. So expected number of infections on the y-axis, and this parameter on the x-axis, and you see it increases with this parameter. So that is natural, but it's not as sharp. So far we've been talking about vaccination decisions done at time 0, and a really natural thing to consider is when they're.
Haifeng has a question for you in the chat.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a question in the previous slides. So you, in the first panel, that alpha, what is the n factor there?
Oh, n is the number of nodes.
Okay, I see. So this number, this alpha can indeed go to very large, because typically n is very large, but CV, C vaccine and C infection is a constant typically.
Right. Yeah, it can become large. Yeah.
I see. So, okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've looked at, like, we have some very basic results when you look at decisions over time. I'll skip that. So maybe in next 5 minutes or so, I'll talk about this other direction about the costs rising from not conforming to peers. So if a node is vaccinated, but its peers are not, then it incurs some cost. And I'll model this as, so if this is vaccinated, then it pays cost beta for every neighbor who has different choice. And then it gets a benefit from vaccination. So this is like negative costs. There's the cost for a node to get vaccinated. If it does not get vaccinated, then its cost is simply the number of neighbors which have an opposite choice, which choose to get vaccinated. And so now the cost structure would be, for a node, there's the cost of non-conforming, and then the vaccination benefit. So you can see this is like the epidemic game with d equals 1, and you can fold it into that. It's also like a coordination game if you don't have this vaccination benefit. Like in the coordination game literature, one can show that a Nash corresponds to a strong community. So you need to change the definition slightly for the strongness of a community to take this vaccination component into account. Basically, a strong community is one in which nodes within a community have a lot of neighbors, have the majority of their neighbors within and a few outside. And a node outside that community has likewise most neighbors outside. So there is a nice connection to threshold type of diffusion models. So what is a threshold model? So we have a threshold value theta v for each node. So we start this threshold model at some set S0. At each time t, node I, which is either in the st-1, if it's in st-1, it's added to st. Or if it has at least theta I neighbors in st-1, it's added to st. Yeah, so this kind of process always has a fixed point. It'll stop at, so suppose it ends at time t. Yeah, so that's a threshold diffusion model. So what we can show is that if you start so choose S0 to be all the nodes whose degree is not too high, and it's this parameter, and run the threshold model starting from this set with thresholds which are like basically majority, so half the degree minus this ratio of CVAC over twice beta. Let it run, and then you get some nodes are vaccinated. So first of all, that's going to be a pure Nash. And this is a Nash which has the fewest number of vaccinated nodes. Yeah. I mean, there can be multiple, no, actually, so there is a, so this is a nice way to, in this particular game, get the number of Nash with the fewest number of nodes. In general, these kinds of questions become really hard in the other epidemic game setting that I mentioned. So getting Nash with fewest ones or most ones, all of those are NP hard. So again, there is some interesting threshold effect here. Sorry, this alpha should be beta. So this is that parameter, the vaccination cost over the peer effect cost beta. When you vary that and you look at the number of nodes in the unvaccinated nodes, they all have this sharp drop. As you vary this parameter, when it's the number of unvaccinated nodes, so as the benefit from, so again, recall that here C is the benefit from getting a vaccine. So as this benefit increases, suddenly the fraction of unvaccinated nodes drops. Yeah, so one thing which I found interesting in many of these formulations is this. So even though there are lots of parameters and the graph structure is complicated, sometimes there are these interesting threshold type of effects, which might have a bearing on how we can use such results and maybe provide some kind of uniformity in the results. So there are lots of dimensions to epidemic games, and information is a big component. It has a significant impact on the game structure. And solving these games is hard, and analyzing their properties, especially when p less than 1. even when we have these results about existence of NASH and that best response works, they don't necessarily converge easily for very large networks. And so improving that is going to be an important question. So in this epidemic game D, the parameter D gives a natural way to control the amount of information available. And it looks like if you use more information, then the better the decentralized strategy becomes in reducing the outbreak size. As I mentioned before, the threshold effects related to these parameters are interesting, and I think that it would be interesting to prove this more rigorously on random graph models at least, and also look at this in other kinds of networks. One big question is what happens when this ratio is not the same for all the nodes. This could vary depending on the node. So to what extent this holds, and we haven't looked at that yet. The other thing is sometimes decentralized strategies, so in some regimes, like we've seen, they can be quite inefficient. So they can have a high social cost or large outbreak. And so it's interesting to look at Stackelberg strategies and incentives to reduce these costs for some selected nodes and end up with NASH equilibria with better properties. There's a particular thread of work that Haifeng has done on signaling, which I think might be relevant here on how to provide signals to nodes when they're deciding so that they are better off getting vaccinated. The general goal is to understand lack of compliance to public health interventions based on these network effects, determine for whom compliance is not in self-interest. So there are many other solution concepts, like there are several problems with NASH. There are multiple equilibria possible, and they might not be realized. It's not, so there are some conditions people know in which you'll have an equilibrium, but in these kinds of games, we don't know whether that's a natural quantity to look at. There are a number of sources of uncertainty, like the source of the outbreak, other infections, like meaning who else is infected, who else is vaccinated, what kinds of strategies they've done, what information is available. Also the network itself, maybe it is realistic to know good information about the immediate neighborhood, but the network as a whole, probably we know some properties maybe. Finally, one big question I would like to propose for the group and would love feedback is agent-based models and network analysis have become ubiquitous now. So in our simulations, we incorporate different kinds of behaviors. For instance, they come from surveys and social science theories or cognitive science and so on. How do you incorporate the role of strategic behaviors? So like when you model these individual behaviors from surveys and so on, you're imputing that you're expecting people to behave that way. How do we think about strategic behavior in specifically, like if you're comparing two vaccination policies, so age-based and maybe based on economic criteria, for instance, based on like if you incorporate behaviors, you might get one kind of ranking, but if you look at compliance based on strategic considerations, maybe that ranking changes. And finally, in this kind of setting, equilibrium might not be reached. So what other solution concepts would be meaningful? Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, Anil. Thank you very much. Excellent talk.
So can you go back to the definition of the costs? Very beginning, what is D? The definition where you explain D and also the costs.
Okay, so D is how much, the parameter which defines how much of the neighborhood information we are aware of. So if D is 2, this node U8 is assumed to know its 2 neighborhood, and it's going to decide its infection risk restricted to that network. So it knows who is vaccinated in that neighborhood. And if a source is chosen randomly in that neighborhood, can then write down a probability of infection for this node.
Can you also show the formula for the vaccination probability?
So let's maybe look at D equals 1, since that's simpler. So in this D equals 1, this is the neighborhood to consider. So the probability U8 gets infected is like 1 over n if this is the source, and then 1 over n times p if this is the source.
Okay, so it assumes that if the disease or if the epidemic starts from any other node, then the node U8 thinks that it's not going to be infected.
Yeah, you can think of it like that, or you could say that when it is, so it's right now it's making that decision based on at time 0, right? The disease hasn't really happened. People have decided who are going to get vaccinated, and that information is available. In its cost benefit analysis, it's looking at this neighborhood and deciding. So it's actually one neighborhood is all of this. So U1, U7, U9, right? So in its one neighborhood, 2 nodes are vaccinated. This node is not vaccinated. So within that neighborhood, it decides it has so like this much probability of getting infected. So this decision is based on an estimate by this node, like of its possible infection cost. There's not the real infection cost, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Okay. It seems to be somewhat dynamic, but it only takes into this. I don't know how to say this, but it seems that it's limited to D.
Yeah, it's using dhop, right? Yeah, because it's not really. Finally, in this cost structure, we're like coming up with some probability. There's an estimate of the probability that node V thinks it is going to get infected times the infection cost. So there are like other papers which don't use a utility theory approach, but some other notion of probability, like people underestimate or overestimate probabilities of certain types, and so there can be a different form.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for the very interesting work. I think this characterization of the Nash equilibria is really nice. I'm actually thinking about what kind of follow-up questions you can possibly ask. In particular, I was thinking, can we bring because Nash equilibria is basically characterizing the case where there's no intervention at all. So the agents are just behave selfishly. I was thinking about how can you bring a social planner who basically is a government into the picture. And if you bring such a social planner, there seems like a lot of more questions you can ask. So you can look at how can the social planner design the intervention scheme to improve the equilibria. In that sense, I think even look at the correlated equilibria is a natural way, because the government might compute the best correlated equilibria, and then you can try to really coordinate the agent's behavior by recommend action to each agent. And you can guarantee the recommendation is actually incentive compatible in the sense that any agent who is recommended the vaccine, he should have just to take the vaccine because that's the best recommendation for him under the correlated equilibrium assumption.
Yeah, I think that would be a really nice thing to explore. And this correlated equilibrium part, actually, this suggests to me another variation. This interesting work that Madhav and Ashla and Chen and others have done on what if vaccines are distributed partly in market and partly through a government, right? So if you're distributing through a market, the cost of a vaccine is not fixed quantity, but so they have a model for how supply demand will drive the cost.
Oh, I see.
Right. So that's, I think, an interesting game structure as well, where there is a correlation of a different type, maybe than or the market forces are driving that kind of correlation in the cost structure.
Yeah, that's right. And also, I think consider a correlated equilibrium seems has another advantage is in your model, you're assuming D equal to 1 or D equal some constant or D equal to infinity. The reason you're assuming, for example, D equal to 2, because the agent really just have limited knowledge, right? He cannot really access the people who are 3 hops away. But if you think from the social planner's perspective, D really equals infinity, because the social planner have a global overview of the entire network structure. And he actually somehow is making things under, he knows everything on the network. If he's a powerful social planner, that actually makes the assumption that d equal to infinity pretty natural in that situation.
Maybe a clarification. So how would you envisage, are you thinking the social planner is going to give some signaling?
Yeah, not even there. Actually, just a social planner try to look at the entire game. There's no signaling at all. It's just the game you're describing.
Yeah.
And I want to compute a correlated equilibrium of the game. And then after that, a correlated equilibrium is basically a distribution over action profiles. Then I recommend the action profile to each agent on the network.
Yeah.
By the definition of correlated equilibria, the recommendation actually is the best that you should do, given that the other people are following my recommendation.
Right.
Actually, I feel like in this setting, it actually makes realistic sense because the social planner, nowadays the government can indeed reach out to different people just by sending them probably a message. So that actually, yeah. So I think that could be the first. So if you bring a social planner into the picture, there are really even more things you can do. Like besides computing correlated equilibria, you can utilize information advantage to intervene behavior, and you can even bring momentary incentive to influence behavior as well. Right? Yeah. You can select a subset of people and then try to reduce their vaccine cost, which actually hopefully even bring a better social outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are all really interesting questions worth exploring.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of very interesting follow-up questions that can be asked.
I had a short comment. So basically that leads to like a mechanism design problems where we can control, for example, the cost of vaccination, for example. That's certainly something that the government can control by market or by just the allocation. And that's going to give some incentive for people to choose their behavior so the optimal natural equilibrium can be reached. And also, there might be some kind of problem. For example, different people have different conceptions of what is the cost of being infected and what is the cost of being vaccinated. So, for example, some simplified model can be studied where the population can be partitioned into people who anti-vaccination and who don't, and then consider that they are either separated or mixed in the population, and then people, how the decisions are made during such assumptions. Not completely heterogeneous, but just with some kind of a partitioning.
Yeah. I think that would be one way to deal with the complexity. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so I guess we're out of time for today, but just want to thank everybody for coming, and again, Anil for his presentation. And just remind everyone, our next seminar will be in 2 weeks. We'll have Jeffrey Townsend from Yale speaking. So that's on the same time, 11:30 on Thursday, January 28th. So hope to see everybody then again.
Yeah, Anil, hopefully you can give part 2 of this talk. I think your talk asked more questions. So
yeah, I think
we can ask you to talk again. So maybe in a couple of months.
Yeah,
I think
more questions than we can.
Yeah, which is great. I think this is what we wanted. Thank you very much.
Thanks.